much what up to. But as a quick note, for anyone who is here for the elusive gray ghost known as CES, I have the QR things, so I'll have them spread out at the end of the class. So, with no further ado, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I know some of your faces, but some of you are quite new to me. So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. My name is Wagner. I have been working here at St. Francis since 2013. I have a PhD in environmental engineering from Penn State. My advisor was Dr. Bruce Logan, who's pretty well known in the environmental engineering field. So we're just kind of backing up in trajectory. Before I went to graduate school for my PhD, I was in the Peace Corps for 2 years in Belize, down in Central America. So I lived there for 2 years with my husband, Aaron. Before that, I was working on a master's degree at Virginia Tech. That was in biological systems engineering, which at Virginia Tech was the department that had formerly been known as agricultural engineering. So some of the courses that I took really had a very distinct agricultural engineering bent. So my work at Penn State was on a technology called microbial fuel cells, and it's a device that allows for bacteria to consume organic matter, so any sort of food source that bacteria will eat, which are many. And there are certain kinds of bacteria that are actually capable of converting that food source into an electric current. So it's a relatively small scale type of device right now, and some of the work that's being done right now is trying to scale these up from what works in the laboratory up to what might work in a real environment. One of the ways that this ties to environmental engineering is that those devices are capable of converting the waste organic matter that we find in wastewaters. So municipal wastewaters and industrial wastewaters, the right bacteria are actually capable of breaking down those wastes, and as they do so, they can generate an electric current. So that's kind of a quick little glimpse into my academic life. But most recently, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to take a sabbatical, which is one of those things that is a real perk of most faculty positions. And I don't know why it's not available for more jobs. It's a really amazing opportunity to kind of refocus, to take a new direction. And basically what I did was to really shift my research. I had been working on microbial electrochemical technologies, microbial fuel cells, here at St. Francis, but I really wanted to do something different. And so I've shifted into looking at a more global scale of the water energy nexus. And so I'm going to talk about that in some detail. But one other thing about me is that I've been department chair here since, well, let's see, this is my 4th year as department chair. And so we usually have a 3-year term, so this is my 2nd 3-year term as department chair. And the department consists of MEX, Math, Engineering, and Computer Science. So if you haven't met me yet, inevitably I will sign some paper for you. You're welcome to come and see me. My office is kind of way down the hall opposite the physics lab. So if you go up and around from the physics lab, that's where you can find me. Down the hall from the student lounge. So I'm really happy to meet any of you. I've had students tell me that they didn't want to bother me because I'm department chair, but actually when you guys bother me, that's probably the most fun part of the day. So be not afraid. Feel free to come down to my office if you have questions about this talk, if you have questions about your academic career, if you have questions about your professional life, internships, if you need a quiet place to cry, come on down. You can borrow my office. All right, so let's get into kind of what this sabbatical opportunity provided for me. I like this little figure over here that helped us to think about how fortunate we are to get to look at our potential professional lives in a number of different ways. What we love to do, what our strengths are, what we can get paid for, and what the world needs. And I have to tell you, for the engineers in the room, which I think is many of you, I just feel like we're really, really lucky that so many of these outer rings of kind of ideas can be met by a fulfilling career in engineering. So one of the things that a sabbatical allowed me to do is to kind of figure out a little bit more clearly what are my passions, what do I really love, and where are my strengths, as well as think a little bit more focused on what I think the world needs while getting paid. So how did I figure out what to do with myself? Well, I've been thinking about global climate change and the sort of myriad kinds of questions that we need to address in order to decarbonize and get a handle on the climate change that's occurring because of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. And so in doing so, I've been keeping track of the literature and who's publishing in this field and where might I be able to plug in. There's so many different ways to consider this problem. And so I didn't want to go and try and become an economist because that's really not my interest and my background. So I was looking more at ways that I could integrate what I already know and what I'm already somewhat expert in with getting a little bit closer to addressing the problem of global climate change. So one of our former students here, actually, we overlapped just for my very first year of teaching here, is Rebecca Peer. So she's here giving a presentation when she was an undergraduate, and here she is graduating from the environmental engineering program in 2014 from St. Francis. So we overlapped just briefly. I taught her in a couple classes, and she has been doing the kind of work that really interests me. So she graduated from our program and went on to the University of Southern California, where she got a PhD in environmental engineering. Then she got a postdoc position at Stanford, and then went on to get a position as a faculty member at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And all this time I've been watching what she's been publishing, and she visited here once, and we've just kept in very loose contact. But when I realized I had this sabbatical opportunity coming up, I reached out to Beck and said, what would it be like if I came and learned as your student the kinds of things that you're doing? And she graciously accepted, and so I was able to share her wonderful office and her colleagues and her network and all of those important things while learning the kinds of things that she was doing in her work and starting to work together. So the student became the teacher. So a really quick introduction to microbial electrochemical technologies. Basically, these cool bacteria can convert waste organic material to electricity. Very, very interesting tech, and not something I regret studying at all. I just needed a different scope. I needed something that was a little less niche. And so I zoomed way out to think about the way in which, at the large scale, at the global scale, that water and energy are interconnected. So they're very obviously interconnected in microbial fuel cells, but I wanted to think about it at the bigger picture. So if you've never seen one of these diagrams before, these are called Sankey diagrams. And the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is really famous for putting out an energy Sankey diagram every year for the US and on a regular basis for many other countries and regions. And you don't need to understand this entire diagram, but basically what's going on is, let's just start by looking at the top half. This is all energy, and these on the left here are what we would call energy sources. So I'm going to talk about energy sources. Don't forget that I'm always talking about energy conversions. We don't have, it's not like these are some magical, we're not like making energy, right? That's fundamentally not physically possible. But these are ways in which, these are materials in which energy has very high density, and we know how to convert them in order to get energy in forms that we want, right? So a lump of coal doesn't do anything for us until we burn it and generate electricity from it. And when we do that, we can get a good deal of electricity per unit volume of coal because it's a pretty high energy density. So on the left here we have energy sources. We have different ways of converting energy, but one I want to point out here is electricity generation. So we have a number of different feedstocks into electricity generation, and then this yellow is usable electricity, and this gray here is what we call dissipated energy. So this is where we have energy inefficiencies, either because of thermodynamics or because of inefficiencies in our own systems. We also have other ways that we convert energy and use it: transportation, residential, commercial, and industrial. The bottom half then is looking at the way in which water is also used. So over here we have surface water and saline water, fresh surface, saline surface, fresh ground, and saline ground. And again, the kind of key place I want you to look is here at thermoelectric cooling. So when we burn this stuff, we don't use the heat directly to make electricity. We use heat to convert water to steam. And it's the movement of the steam upwards, because of the phenomenon of heat rising, it's the movement of steam upwards that allows a turbine to turn. And it's that electromagnetic, the foundational electromagnetic principles in a turning coil of wire surrounded by magnets that converts that movement into electricity. So that's actually a lot of conversions going on there, right? We have some sort of chemical here in our fossil fuels. We burn those to create heat. We use that heat to create steam, which has kinetic energy. We use that kinetic energy to create rotational energy. We use that rotational energy to create electricity due to the interaction between those coils of wires and a magnet. So it's not as straightforward as you might think. And in doing so, there's a fair bit of wasted energy and a high amount of water usage. So when we think about the way that we use water, a lot of it gets returned. So this says surface discharge or ocean discharge. So a lot of the water in an electrical generating power plant uses water, but then that water actually returns right to the watershed from where it came. But not all of it does. A good bit of it also evaporates into the atmosphere, in which case it's not lost to the earth, but it is considered consumed water because that water is no longer present in the environment, in the watershed from where it came. So if you have a watershed and you're doing a water balance on a specific watershed, and you're burning fossil fuels and generating steam, you're going to lose a good bit of water to your watershed. Does that make sense? All right, so all of this is the kind of thing that I wanted to get into and take a look at. Because what's going to happen as we consider dealing with climate change is that the proportions here on the left side are going to change. The portfolio of how we generate electricity and how we get the energy needs fulfilled in these other areas, transportation, residential, commercial, and industrial, they're going to change. Part of what they're changing for is getting off of carbon so that we're not emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Part of it is going to be just simply economic. Or maybe not simply economic, but a lot of it may end up being politically driven or policy driven economics. So down here we have nuclear, geothermal, hydro, wind, and solar, a small proportion at this point, but I anticipate that these will grow and that they will be much more varied. So this is the United States water energy nexus, but I have a feeling that regionally we're going to see a lot of variability in the way in which these sources of energy are distributed. The sources of energy have a great deal of impact on how much water is required in order to convert those sources of energy into something usable. And that's starting to get at the real point of what I'm interested in studying. So this question of climate change has been described as our wicked problem, the wicked problem of your generation, of our current century. And this idea of a wicked problem, it sort of sounds like you're from Boston and it just means bad. But overall, climate scientists and other scientists use this idea of a wicked problem is one that is incredibly complex. And so there are many, many different ways to become a part of addressing the solution of climate change, but it can't be done just by one field, it can't be done just at one institution, it can't be done just in one country. It's a wicked problem because it takes so many different pieces to work together to get to a good solution. So this was a quote from, what year was this one? So this is 2021, but it's been talked about this way long before, so this is back in 2014, again, thinking about controlling global climate change, something we've understood from a physical standpoint for many, many decades, and are still getting our head wrapped around from a policy standpoint. But if you just want kind of a quick slide to talk about what it means, here we're looking at 1880. We're really getting into the heart of the Industrial Revolution at that point. We're over here into like 2010. And this black line is representing the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. We tend to talk about that in parts per million. So like there's a group called 350.org, and their goal was to keep climate change carbon dioxide at or below 350 parts per million. We've gone way past that at this point. And then these values here are temperature anomalies, so temperature variation from an average over this entire time period. And you can see that while there are a few, there's some variation, that overall we are seeing increasingly hotter temperatures at a global average. These hotter temperatures are one thing, but there's also a great deal of influence on climate overall when you warm up the atmosphere. So it changes a lot more than just it feels hot outside. It also changes the energy that gets built up in things like tornadoes and hurricanes. It also increases the extremes on temperature, on climate activity. So dry times tend to stay drier, and rainfall tends to be more intense when we have hotter pockets over the average of the globe. All right, so back to the water energy nexus. That's kind of all I'm going to say about climate change. I could talk about climate change all day and all night. There's some really, really nice documentaries on PBS done by a guy named Richard Alley. He works just up the road at Penn State and has been, he's been studying ice cores for decades and decades. And his work got him involved with PBS, and he's done some really nice documentaries about global climate change and the scientific basis behind what's going on there. So really, really lots of great information out there, and I can talk about it, like I said, all day. But back to kind of what I'm focusing down on. So I want to talk to you about something called virtual water, and this concept comes to us from the world of agriculture. So that's meant to be just a little schematic of corn there. So when we grow corn, if we then ship the corn, so let's say I've grown corn and now I'm going to ship it over here to Jacob. So now Jacob has the corn, and he also has the water associated with the corn. So if you take an ear of corn and you desiccate it, you can measure the ear of corn right off the stalk, and then you can desiccate it, you can evaporate off all the water, and you measure the corn after, and that will tell you how much water is embedded in that corn. But there's also water embedded in the entire process that it took to grow the corn. So there's more water associated with an ear of corn, for example, or an entire tanker of corn, than there is just within the food itself. There's also all the water that it took to get that from a seed all the way up to a harvestable product. We call that embedded water virtual water. And when we trade it, we can talk then about the virtual water trade. So if I ship my corn to Jacob, he is benefiting not only by getting the food source, but also the water that his economy, his watershed, doesn't have to expend in order to get that corn. And I'm using corn, but I mean this for all of agriculture, right? So not only do you get the food, but you also get the relief of the burden, the cost of the water of growing that corn. So the same is also true for any kind of energy commodity. So it's really obvious if we think about energy, like think about wood pellets. Okay, wood pellets are actually a very common heating fuel all across the globe. And you can imagine, just like corn, if we harvest wood, make it into wood pellets, and trade it, there was water embedded in that wood. Even if you've totally desiccated the wood, there's still water embedded in the process that it took to grow the tree. This is also true for electricity generation. So if you consume water and you lose some water from your watershed in order to generate electricity, say from coal, by using thermoelectric energy generation, you've produced steam, you've turned a turbine, that steam has evaporated and is no longer part of your watershed. If now you ship that electricity across national lines, so maybe Jacob's in Canada, so now he has my United States electricity and also the embedded water that's associated with that. So in addition to thinking about it for agriculture, we can also think about this virtual water and the trade of virtual water for energy commodities. And that's the little narrow slice of the research into global climate change that I'm working on right now and that I worked on during my sabbatical. So what's it have to do with climate change exactly? As we change those portfolios of energy that were on the left of that Sankey diagram, the amount of energy, or the amount of water being traded as virtual water with those energy commodities is going to change. Particularly as we move away from more traditional thermoelectric generation into things like wind and solar, the water footprint of those conversion technologies, wind and solar for example, is much lower than the water footprint for thermoelectric energy generation. The water footprint is also lower for things like wind and solar than it is for biofuels. Things like ethanol made from corn, there's a large water footprint associated with those materials. Sometimes a region is very water rich and that expense is not problematic. But in other regions where there's a large water scarcity, we want to be thinking about whether or not importing energy that's made with a large water footprint could be a benefit to them so that they don't have that burden themselves. All right, so let's think about how this work happens. So the first question is thinking about how much, where, and when is this embedded water, this virtual water associated with energy commodities being traded. So I've been updating the information that already existed kind of in the field, in databases, about global virtual water trade information. There's new information on water footprints. So if you think about hydroelectric generation, so a dam, you might think like, wow, yeah, you dam the water, and then it flows through turbines, and the water comes out on the other side. Where's there a water footprint? How is water being lost? But because of the reservoirs, there's a lot more evaporation out of a reservoir than there would have been in the natural moving water body. And so there is a water footprint associated with hydroelectric power generation. It's not as much as thermoelectric, but it still exists. All right, so in all of these cases, the last data that exists on these water footprints is pretty old that's been used in any virtual water trade work. So I've been updating the virtual water trade work with the newer data and the newer processes that we have explaining how much water is associated per unit of energy with these different conversion technologies. It also matters what the resolution of time is. So if you look at a yearly average, you're going to get one picture of the way in which energy generation is related to the water footprint. But if you break it down and look monthly or seasonally, energy use changes monthly or seasonally across most communities, and the water footprint of the energy use also changes monthly or seasonally. Almost all of the work has been done looking at annual averages. So looking at it on a more temporally resolved basis is going to help us understand where this water is going. So this is not a real figure, but this is the kind of figure that I'm able to generate to give, and by not real, I mean the data isn't accurate, but this is the kind of figure that I'll be able to generate. And what we're looking at here is like this yellow area is a region. So let's say East Asia. And we look and we can see that there's virtual water traded within East Asia, but then we can also see the movement of energy embedded water to different regions. So South Asia, the Caribbean, North America, you can see the movement of water to and from the different regions, and the width of those arrows represents, is proportional to the quantity of water that's moving. So I mentioned that we can consider different water footprints. This data here is from 2012. So back in 2012, the only water footprint data we had from hydropower was based on just a couple of dozen reservoirs and dams associated with those reservoirs. Moved to 2018, and we don't have virtual water data built from these water footprints, but we now have water footprints that are much, much more highly resolved. Look at all of those data points. Over 2,000 different reservoirs now have been used to describe the water associated with hydroelectric reservoirs. Again, thinking about the temporal change. So here you can see this is, so each month here is represented by this suite of years. And this data is for all of the countries in what's called the IEA. It's the International Energy Association. And they're a group of countries that share and compile and analyze a lot of their energy data. So you can really here see that across that suite of 47 countries, there are these annual fluctuations within the year for their net electricity production. So it's that kind of fluctuation that's also going to have an impact on the virtual water trade. These times of year are going to require less electricity, and so there's likely to be more reliance on local and regional resources than in importing a great deal of energy at that time. Another kind of example here, and the only thing I want to point out in this particular figure, is that because energy use across nations is very different at scale. So this is the United States up here, and you can see that our energy use is so much higher, and therefore our water footprint is so much higher, that the rest of these countries kind of wash out. So any fluctuations here are difficult to see when we try and look at things together. So it is important to tease apart regional differences to understand what's going on at different areas of the globe. Just another figure kind of showing a similar concept. All right, so the other thing that I want to think about in this research, and that I've been kind of digging into a bit, is whether or not this trade of virtual water affects regions that are considered water scarce. And the first thing I learned as I really dug deep into what does it mean to be water scarce is that it kind of means whatever you want. Every paper I read describing water stress or water scarcity had some different variation of a metric by which they were defining water scarcity or water stress. So really, to do this work, I'm just going to have to make a decision. I'm not going to go in and come up with a whole new metric for water scarcity. That's not the way I want to go. I don't want to become an expert in that. So I want to determine whose metrics I think are the most relevant, whose metrics talk most cohesively with this concept of virtual water. So this first one is this concept of water risk, and it comes to us from it's called Aqueduct 4.0, and all of a sudden I'm up here drawing a blank at who produces Aqueduct 4.0, and I don't have it in my notes. I'm just totally drawing a blank. Oh, the Water Resources Institute. There it is. Okay. So there's an organization, a big global community of researchers called the Water Resources Institute. They do this analysis of water risk. They publish it in something called Aqueduct 4.0. And it incorporates a lot of different metrics into what does it mean to be a nation at risk in terms of water. So some of it's really quantitative, like measurable amounts of rainwater, runoff, infiltration, those kinds of things. But there's also an incorporation of political instability and poor policy and management of water that also gets incorporated into a country's water risk metric. There's a second metric that I found that I thought was really interesting, and it's called green water scarcity. And another thing, when you start to look at water at sort of a large scale, you get a lot of colors of water. So there's blue water and green water and gray water and all different kinds, and you got to know who you're talking to. Are you talking to the water scarcity people? Or are you talking to the hydrology people to know whose water color means what? But anyway, this particular set of authors, they have been researching, particularly this gentleman, Dr. Hoekstra, researching in the water resources field for decades, and they've developed this concept called green water scarcity. And what they're talking about with green water is water that falls as precipitation and does not run off into surface water immediately. So it infiltrates into the ground and becomes available for plants. So it's a kind of little slice of precipitation. Some precipitation runs off and another portion of it infiltrates into the ground. That's what they're calling green water. And they're interested in exploring the scarcity of green water because of its value to ecosystems and its value to the biodiversity that is part of their focus in identifying areas that have green water scarcity. So if the green water is not available for natural ecosystems, then it's considered scarce. So in this metric, the light colors indicate that there's not much scarcity. And when you get up to almost black here, then we have areas where the green water is considered scarce. So there is a portion of this green water that they parcel out to be dedicated to conserved land in order to maintain biodiversity and natural ecosystems in each country. So when I first showed this in New Zealand where I was doing my research, they said, we are not a water scarce region. We do not have water risk. Why are we labeled as greater than 1? And the reason for this is that yes, while they have very temperate, it's a very temperate ecosystem, a decent amount of rainfall, the land is all claimed for something. So there is some conserved land, but it doesn't meet the metric that this particular green water scarcity metric requires to maintain biodiversity. And everything else in New Zealand is going to something engineered. So it's going into agriculture. There's a large dairy industry and a large sheep industry, a wool industry in New Zealand, or it's going into forested land. And because those two are not natural ecosystems, they're engineered ecosystems, then they don't count in retaining enough water to not fall below 1 in the green water scarcity index. So these are two ways of thinking about, does our region have enough water? And is there water, for example, that we should shift away from energy commodities so that we could have more water for the other needs, for natural ecosystems or for other engineered ecosystems that require water? Or do we have extra water that we could apply to things like biofuel crops and then have that as an energy resource for us moving forward? Likewise, would we be better off importing or exporting a specific energy commodity in order to release any of the pressure on our water resources? So this is just an example of one of the ports on the coastline of New Zealand. This is probably construction timber, but they also do grow a lot of forest materials that become a biofuel, that become used for wood heating. Really, really large forestry industry in New Zealand. So I went to New Zealand and I got into this research and I learned how to code in Python and I learned how to read these articles and who were the most important researchers in the field and how to kind of get myself moving towards